All right, kicking off the new year with a deep dive into the latest PortalFuse weekly security update report. Should be a good one for us, especially as seasoned Microsoft system admins. I think the focus for us today should be understanding the top vulnerabilities and the most impactful KBs from this report.
Yeah, I'm excited to get back into it. And yeah, you're right. Got to stay ahead of the curve, especially with how sophisticated these threats are getting.
For sure. Okay, so CVE 2025-21307, it's critical one. Remote code execution in the Windows Reliable Multicast Transport Driver, RMCAT, they call it. That one definitely stands out as a high priority.
Right off the bat, yeah. And for good reason. It's a use-after-free vulnerability. Basically lets an attacker send these specially crafted packets, to a PGM socket.
And the scary part is?
Yeah. It's remotely exploitable, no authentication needed, no user interaction. That's what makes this one really concerning.
Yeah, just thinking about a bad actor being able to, totally compromise the system without any warning signs.
Exactly. That's the worst-case scenario here. Complete system compromise. Confidentiality, integrity, availability, everything's at risk.
So patching is, obviously.
Oh, yeah. Patching is absolutely critical, but there are other things we can do. First off, make sure you're not running anything that needs to listen on those PGM ports.
Okay, so double check those.
Yep. Then, firewall, always good practice. Protect any open ports. And try to avoid exposing those PGM receivers to the public internet if you can help it.
Good points, all of those.
Okay.
Moving on, CVE 2025-21294, another critical one. Remote code execution again, but this time in Microsoft Digest authentication.
This one's a race condition vulnerability. Leads to a use-after-free situation. Happens when you connect to a system that uses, digest authentication.
Similar to the last one in terms of...
Yeah, in terms of exploitability. Remote, no user interaction needed.
And the impact.
Same story. Confidentiality, integrity, availability, all potentially gone. Patching is, it's paramount.
Okay, so we've got two critical remote code execution vulnerabilities so far. Now this one, CVE 2025-21382, this is a... critical elevation of privilege vulnerability. It's in the Windows graphics component. No user interaction needed for this one either, right?
That's right. It's a combination of integer overflow and a heap-based buffer overflow. Allows attackers to gain system privileges.
Oh, wow. Okay, so even though this one needs local access.
Yeah, it still doesn't need any user interaction. And it can be exploited with even with low privileges.
So even if it's not remote, it's still a pretty serious threat.
Definitely. Security updates as soon as possible. No question about it.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
Let's see. CVE 2025-21311. This is another elevation of privilege vulnerability. This time it's with Windows NTLM v1.
Yeah. This one's a little different. It's the authentication algorithm itself that's the problem here. It's implemented incorrectly, making it remotely exploitable.
And no user interaction.
Nope, no user interaction. And no prior access needed either.
So no one that's just waiting to be exploited.
And it's rated as low complexity, which basically means it's pretty easy to exploit.
Yikes. Okay, so patching is priority number one. Is there anything else we can do to mitigate this one?
Yeah, actually. You could set the LM compatibility LVL to 5. It'll disable NTLM v1, but still allow NTL v2. So you're basically reducing the attack surface.
That's a good strategy. Okay, so we've covered a few of the really high-profile vulnerabilities, but this report's packed with them. We've got CVE 2025-21411, remote code execution in the Windows telephony service. And then there's CVE 2025-21389, a denial of service vulnerability in Windows up@host.dll. And honestly, looking at this list, it really drives home the point that we need to be thinking bigger than just patching.
You got it. Network segmentation, least privilege, proactive threat hunting. These are all things we need to be doing, not just reacting to the latest CVE.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I mean, we've got CVE 2025-21370, elevation of privilege, Windows VBS Enclave, and then CVE 2025-21343, information disclosure, Windows Web Threat Defense. It just goes on and on.
Yep. And they all point to the need for a layered approach to security.
Right, exactly. Take CVE 2025-21338, the remote code execution in GDI plus Flipboard. We can't just rely on one thing to protect us from threats like this.
Yeah, it's all about being vigilant and proactive. It's a mindset shift,
Totally. And then speaking of information disclosure, there's CVE 2025-21336, which targets Windows cryptography. Attackers could potentially read sensitive information from encrypted PKCS1 data.
Yeah, and that one's interesting because it can be used for cross-VM attacks. You could have multiple virtual machines compromised because of this vulnerability. So they're recommending you redeploy the virtual secure mode policies with the updated guidance. It'll help block the rollback of virtualization-based security updates.
Right. So even after patching, there are still steps to take to really lock things down.
For sure. And then you've got CVE 2025-21329 and CVE 2025-21328. Both of those are Mayperalta-Zone security feature bypass vulnerabilities.
Can you explain what Mayperalta-Zone does?
Sure. It's a security feature that maps a URL to a specific security zone. So like the internet zone or the local intranet zone.
Got it. So what's the issue here?
Well, these vulnerabilities are caused by improper resolution of path equivalence. So an attacker could bypass this security feature.
Meaning
a malicious website could be treated as a trusted one.
Oh, okay. That's not good. So that could lead to
execution of malicious code, unauthorized access to sensitive information. Yeah, it's a problem.
Definitely something to keep an eye on. All right, next up we have CVE 2025-21323, CVE 2025-21320, and CVE 2025-21319. The report groups these together as Windows kernel memory information disclosure vulnerabilities.
Yeah, these are all about sensitive information being inserted into log files. Attacker could exploit these to get access to memory addresses in the kernel space.
And that could be used to
launch more sophisticated attacks, yeah. It shows how even seemingly minor information disclosures can have cascading effects.
Okay. That makes sense. Now, CVE 2025-21314, this is a Windows smart screen spoofing vulnerability.
Right.
So this is affecting the smart screen filter that's supposed to protect users from like malicious websites and downloads.
Right. With this vulnerability, attackers can misrepresent critical information in the smart screen user interface.
So they could trick a user into
running a malicious file thinking it's safe, yeah.
So even with security features like smart screen, user education is still incredibly important.
100%. Got to make sure people know what to look out for.
All right. Moving on to CVE 2025-21305 and CVE 2025-21303. Both of these are remote code execution vulnerabilities in the Windows telephony service.
Yeah. So CVE 2025-20305, that one's a heap-based buffer overflow. And then CVE 2025-21303 stems from a use after free condition.
How would an attacker exploit these?
They'd typically try to trick a user into sending a request to a malicious server. And then that server would send back harmful data.
So again, it's that combination of social engineering and technical exploit.
Yep. Got to address both sides of the equation, technical and human.
Okay, let's take a look at CVE 2025-21291. It's a remote code execution vulnerability in Windows Direct Show.
Yeah, this one's caused by a double free error. And it can lead to remote code execution, but this one does require user interaction.
How so?
An authenticated client would need to click a link, then an unauthenticated attacker could exploit it.
So in this case, user education would be focused on, not clicking suspicious links.
Exactly. Good link hygiene is important. All right, moving on to CVE 2025-21288 and CVE 2025-21272. These are both Windows COM server information disclosure vulnerabilities.
It looks like these are caused by the use of uninitialized resources. What kind of impact could that have?
They could expose sensitive user data outside of the app container execution environment.
And do these require user interaction?
Nope. No user interaction needed, and they can be exploited with low privileges.
So another silent but potentially damaging threat.
Exactly. Now, for the Windows Virtual Trusted Platform module, we have CVE 2025-21284 and CVE 2025-21280, both denial of service vulnerabilities.
Okay, what's the deal with these?
They're both caused by improper input validation, and they could disrupt the availability of the affected component.
So another reminder to make sure we're doing robust input validation across the board.
Absolutely. Can't stress that enough.
All right. CVE 2025-21278. This one's a denial of service vulnerability in the Windows Remote Desktop Gateway. RD Gateway.
Yeah, it's caused by a race condition. Improper synchronization could lead to a total loss of availability for the RD Gateway service.
So anyone relying heavily on RD Gateway would want to, take care of this one quickly.
Patching is key here. You want to avoid any potential outages.
For sure. Now, there are a couple more Mayperalta-Zone security feature bypass vulnerabilities. CVE 2025-21268 and CVE 2025-2219. We've seen a few of these already.
Right. These are similar to the ones we discussed before. Same root cause, improper resolution of path equivalence.
So same mitigation strategies.
Pretty much, yeah. They require user interaction, like opening a malicious file, so user education is a big part of it.
Okay. Let's move on to CVE 2025-21256. This is an elevation of privilege vulnerability in Windows digital media.
This one could allow an attacker to gain system privileges.
Oh, wow. That's serious.
It is, but it does require physical access to the system. The attacker would need to manipulate the vulnerable component.
Okay, so if an attacker can get physical access,
then it's a significant threat, yeah. It's susceptible to out-of-bounds, read, and heap-based buffer overflow issues.
Got it. So physical security is still important, even in today's world.
Absolutely. You can't ignore the physical side of things.
All right. Moving on, we have a few more remote code execution vulnerabilities to cover. CVE 2025-21245, CVE 2025-21244, and CVE 2025-21243. All three of these are in the Windows telephony service.
These are all a bit different in terms of their underlying causes. CVE 2025-21245 is a heap-based buffer overflow. CVE 2025-2244 is an integer overflow. And CVE 2025-21243 is, it's also an integer overflow, but a different kind.
But the attack vector is the same for all three.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same. Attacker tricks the user into sending a request to a malicious server, and then the server sends back harmful data.
So once again, we see that combination of social engineering and technical exploitation.
Yep. It's a common theme, unfortunately.
Okay, let's talk about CVE 2025-21234. This is an elevation of privilege vulnerability in Windows print workflow users ACC.
This one's caused by improper input validation, could allow an attacker to escalate privileges, but only from a low integrity level to a medium integrity level.
So it's not as serious as, say, gaining system privileges.
Right. It's within a contained execution environment, but it could be a stepping stone to a bigger compromise.
Okay, so it's still something we need to take seriously.
Definitely. Every vulnerability, no matter how small, should be addressed.
Right. CVE 2025-21220, information disclosure vulnerability, affects Microsoft message queuing.
This one could allow an attacker to read portions of heap memory over the network.
And what causes this one?
Uninitialized resources and no user interaction required to exploit it.
So another one of those vulnerabilities that could be exploited without the user even knowing it.
Unfortunately, yeah. It really highlights the need for proactive security monitoring.
Okay. Now we've got another MIP roll to zone vulnerability, CVE 2025-2189. Seems like we're seeing a lot of these.
Yeah, this one's another security feature bypass. Just emphasizes the need for a, defense in depth approach.
Right. Multiple layers of protection are essential. Can't rely on just one thing.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm noticing that a lot of these CVEs reference KB50700002 and KB500009. What's the significance of those?
Those are the latest cumulative updates, LCUs. They contain the fixes for these vulnerabilities, but it's also important to remember the servicing stack updates.
SSUs, can you explain what those are again?
Sure. Think of them as the foundation for installing LCUs. They make sure the update functionality itself works properly. You need to install the SSUs before any other updates.
So, like, if the foundation is shaky, the whole structure's at risk.
That's a good way to put it. If you have automatic updates enabled, you should be fine. But always good to double check, make sure nothing's, messing with the update process.
Good advice. I also noticed a section in the report about removing LCUs using the DISM command.
Oh, yeah. If you need to remove an LCU after installing the combined SSU and LCU package, you can use the DISM remove package command, but you need the right LCU package name. You can get that by running DISM online get packages. It'll list all the installed packages. One thing, though, don't use divisa.usa.exe with the uninstall switch on the combined package. It won't remove the SSU correctly.
So stick with DISM for LCU removal.
Yep, that's the best way to go about it.
All right. Last thing. The report mentions a PowerShell script for modifying OpenSSH directory permissions.
Yeah, Microsoft's looking into an issue with OpenSSH directory permissions. They provided this script as a temporary workaround. It sets specific permissions for the C program data and C program data logs directories, helps mitigate some potential security risks while they figure out a permanent solution.
So a temporary fix for now.
That's right. Just a way to address a potential vulnerability while they work on a more permanent fix.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground so far. It's amazing how much information is packed into these reports. It's a real testament to the complexity of the security landscape.
For sure. And we're not even done yet. Still a lot more to unpack.
You're right. Before we dive back in, though, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on something I've been noticing. There are a lot of these vulnerabilities that stem from memory corruption issues, buffer overflows specifically.
Yeah, it's a recurring problem. Even with all the advancements in secure coding, buffer overflows are still popping up.
It just goes to show that secure coding practices are more important than ever.
I couldn't agree more. We need to be, extremely diligent in our testing and validation processes.
Absolutely. Okay, well, let's dive back into the report and tackle the rest of these CVEs.
Okay, so let's pick back up with a couple more denial of service vulnerabilities. We've got CVE-2025-21310, which is in Windows upandfos.dll. This one can be exploited remotely to cause a disruption of service, and it doesn't require any user interaction or any special privileges.
So, kind of like some of the others we've talked about, it could be exploited without anyone even realizing it's happening.
Yeah.
And it could lead to a pretty big disruption.
Exactly. It really highlights the point that that uncontrolled resource consumption, it can be just as damaging as, a code execution vulnerability, potentially lead to a complete service outage.
Definitely something to be aware of. So patching is still the main takeaway here.
Patching is always the best defense. But for this specific one, for folks that are using security-only updates, they need to make sure they're also installing the Internet Explorer cumulative updates. That'll address this vulnerability.
Good to know. Okay, let's talk about CVE 2025-21266. This is another denial of service vulnerability, but this time it's targeting the Windows Maypearl to zone function.
Right. This one's a bit different. It's caused by an integer underflow issue. Attacker can exploit it by sending specially crafted packets that basically mess with the service availability.
So similar to the last one in terms of impact, it can disrupt service and potentially cause an outage.
Yeah, pretty much. It's remotely exploitable, no user interaction needed, no special privileges needed. So it's definitely one to be aware of.
All right. Let's move on to CVE 2025-21217. This is the Windows NTLM spoofing vulnerability.
This one's interesting. It allows an attacker to potentially impersonate another user. They exploit a failure in the protection mechanism of NTLM.
Okay, so they can basically trick the system into thinking they're someone else.
Right. But this one does require user interaction. The attacker would need to, trick someone into clicking a specially crafted URL.
So user education is key here, making sure people understand not to click suspicious links.
Absolutely. Phishing attacks are a big problem, and this vulnerability just makes it that much easier for attackers to pull them off. So yeah, user education is super important, making sure people understand the risks and, how to stay safe online.
All right. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the KB articles that are mentioned throughout the report. We see KB 5050000021 and KB 50000009 a lot. What's the deal with those?
Those are the latest cumulative updates, the LCUs for Windows. They contain the fixes for all the vulnerabilities we've been talking about. But it's also important to remember the servicing stack updates, the
SCUs. You mentioned those earlier. Can you remind us what those are and why they're important?
Sure. Think of the SSUs as the foundation for installing the LCUs. They make sure that the update functionality itself is working correctly. You need to install the SSUs before any other updates, including LCUs or security updates.
So basically, if the SSUs aren't installed correctly, then the other updates might not install correctly either.
Exactly. It can cause all sorts of problems. If you have automatic updates enabled, you should be fine. But it's always a good idea to, double check and make sure there aren't any manual configurations that are interfering with the update process.
Good advice. I also noticed a section in the report about removing LCUs using the dism command. Can you walk us through that process?
Sure. If you need to remove an LCU after you've installed the combined SSU and LCU package, you can use the dism remove package command line option, but you need to use the correct LCU package name. You can get that by running dism online get packages. That'll give you a list of all the installed packages.
Okay, so I get the package name, and then I can use dism to remove it. Got it.
Right. But there's one important thing to remember. Don't use divusa.exe with the uninstall switch on the combined package. That won't remove the SSU correctly, and that can cause problems down the line.
So stick with dsymum for LCU removal. Got it. What about this PowerShell script that's mentioned in the report? It's for modifying OpenSSH directory permissions.
Yeah, Microsoft's currently investigating an issue with OpenSSH directory permissions. They provided that script as a temporary workaround to to modify those permissions. It sets specific permissions for the C program data and C program data logs directories.
So it's basically a way to mitigate some potential security risks while they figure out a more permanent solution.
Exactly. It's just a temporary fix, but it's important to implement it while they're working on a more permanent fix.
All right, makes sense. We're getting through this report. There's a lot of information here, and I think it really underscores the importance of staying informed about these vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. And we're not done yet. We still got a few more CVEs to cover. But before we dive back in, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on something. I've noticed a pattern in this report. A lot of these vulnerabilities are related to the Windows telephony service. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you're right. We've seen a few of those already. It does seem like that service is maybe a little more vulnerable than some of the others.
It could be a couple of things. Maybe it's just a more complex service, so there's more opportunity for vulnerabilities to creep in. Or maybe it's something about the way it's designed that makes it, more susceptible to these types of attacks.
Interesting. It's something to keep an eye on for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, let's dive back into the report and see what other vulnerabilities we need to be aware of.
Okay, let's wrap things up with a few final vulnerabilities from the report. Starting with CVE-2025-21213. This one's focused on secure boot.
Ah, yes, secure boot. If there's a vulnerability there, you know it's going to be a big deal.
Right. This one is a secure boot security feature bypass. So it basically lets improperly signed binaries be loaded during the boot process.
So an attacker could potentially, load up some malicious code that gets around the secure boot protection.
Exactly. And if an attacker has physical access to a device, that risk goes way up.
Yeah, physical security is still so important these days. It's easy to overlook that.
For sure. It's not just about software and networks anymore. You've got to protect the hardware, too.
Absolutely. Okay, what about CVE-2024-7344? This one's also related to secure boot, right?
Yeah, this one's interesting. It's with a third-party UEFI implementation from Haoyar, Taiwan.
Yeah.
Basically, it allows secure boot to be bypassed because the signature validation isn't strong enough.
So it's not directly a Microsoft vulnerability, but it still affects systems running Windows if they're using this specific UEFI implementation.
Yep. It's a good reminder that we need to be thinking about the whole stack, not just the operating system, the whole ecosystem.
Totally agree. All right, moving on to CVE 2025-21310. This one has to do with the Windows smart card reader.
Right. It's an information disclosure vulnerability. It could let an attacker get access to sensitive data that's stored on a smart card.
Smart cards are used for authentication, secure access, all sorts of things. So this could be a big deal for organizations that rely on smart cards.
Yeah, for sure. It's crucial to make sure those smart card readers and the associated software, that it's all patched and, configured securely.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier. User education. It seems like a lot of these vulnerabilities that we've talked about, they rely on some level of user interaction, whether it's clicking a bad link or opening a suspicious attachment. What are some key things our listeners should keep in mind when it comes to, educating their users about security?
I think the most important thing is to emphasize that security is everyone's responsibility. It's not just on the IT team. Everyone needs to be aware of the risks and take steps to protect themselves. And that means providing regular security awareness training, stuff like, how to spot a phishing attack, what social engineering is, password best practices, all that good stuff.
Right, because even with all the technical safeguards in place, if a user clicks on a malicious link, that can bypass all of that.
Exactly. It's the human element that's often the weakest link. So we need to, train our users to be our first line of defense.
Well said. Okay, so we've reached the end of our deep dive into this PortalFuse weekly security update report. It's been quite a journey. There are a lot of vulnerabilities to keep track of, and it can feel overwhelming at times.
It can be a lot to take in, for sure. But the good news is there are things we can do to protect ourselves and our organizations.
Absolutely. We just need to stay informed, stay proactive, and work together. A big thank you to you for joining me today and sharing your expertise. It's been a great discussion.
The pleasure was all mine. Always happy to, talk shop with a fellow sysadmin.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next week with more security insights. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and as always, keep those systems patched.